keynote speaker for the day, Dan Shefet. He's a lawyer at the Paris Court of Appeal, France, and an expert with the Council of Europe on the Internet Ombudsman. He's also an honorary member of the European Lawyers Union and an individual specialist to UNESCO. In 2014, he founded the Association for Accountability and Internet Democracy, whose main objective is to introduce a general principle of accountability on the Internet. Dan is also a frequent speaker at international conferences and academic venues on IT law, data privacy, content regulation, and human rights on the Internet. With a huge round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Dan Shefet. He will be talking on the essential skill.
Hear me? Yeah, now it works. Thank you, everybody, for getting up here in the middle of the night. That's really, I'm really delighted. And Jeffrey, that was a very, very interesting presentation. Don't worry, I won't talk too much law, but there will be a few points, and one of them is going to be pure law. I had a problem deciding what subject I really wanted to talk about today, because this whole conference being about technology and about humanism and education is so vast that whenever I found a subject, I changed my mind and found another one that was even better. Until one day, I was actually on vacation, it occurred to me that I understood what the real problem was, what the real challenge was that we are facing today in terms of education, humanity, and technology. But before getting to that, which I call the essential skill, just try and answer the following question. What I have right now is something that's worth billions of dollars, something that corporations are fighting for every second round the clock. And what is that? What do I have right now which is worth billions of dollars? Your attention. I have your attention. So what I'm going to ask you, please, is to focus and concentrate that attention. I know it's going to be hard. Put away your phones. Get back in the driver's seat. Be in control. Let's us decide where our attention goes. Now, the reason I mention that is that that's so key for education. Now, before I get to what happened when I was on vacation and understood what the real problem is, let me tell you another story inside the story. You know, building it up, right? Lawrence, I'm glad you're here. Stand up, everybody can see Lawrence. Our friend from Germany. Hello, Lawrence. As you can tell, Lawrence didn't know I was going to pull this trigger on him. And Lawrence and I, we didn't know each other, but we met in Delhi. And we flew together from Delhi to this place. And Lawrence was my victim for 2 hours, right? You sat next to me and you pretended to enjoy it. So that was lovely. That was lovely. At a certain point in time, Lawrence dozes off, which gives me the opportunity to look at this lovely seat pocket in front of me, and I found this newspaper. And there was this incredible story about a Japanese man called Okihodo Kondo. Do you know who that is? Okihodo Kondo. You know what he did? He got married. Now, what's so strange about that? Why was that in the newspapers? He got married to a hologram. What? He got married to a hologram. This guy invited 40 people to his wedding. It cost him $17,500, or the equivalent in yen, and he got married to a hologram. 35 years old. And he loves it, or her, or whatever. You know, what is this universe we're creating? So I started understanding what the real problem is. When I was on vacation, it was in the south of France, in Cannes, lovely place. And so I went to the beach every day, about 10 days or something like that. And there was this girl on the beach, 2.5 years old. She wasn't playing in the sand. She wasn't swimming. She was sitting there on the beach, playing with her phone, right? Her phone, not her mother's phone, her phone. 2.5 years old. I suddenly understood what the problem was. Bang. Okay. Are we on? Here she is. Isn't she lovely? Her name is Maya. Now you see, this was not a sunny day, so she wasn't on the beach that day. She was cycling. But she's got her phone in her hand. 2.5 years old. What is the universe of Maya going to be when she's 10, when she's 15, when she's 18? With people marrying holograms? I mean, what is the world that we're creating for Maya? What are her values going to be? How will she get her knowledge? How will she get her information? Will she get it from school, or will she get it from this thing that's with her all the time? Or whatever it will be in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, and 5 years. Well, I'm afraid, I'm seriously afraid, that everything she will know will be what this thing tells her. And her attention, well, you know, I'll get to the book. Her attention will be captured by this. And in reality, she won't know very much, because whenever she wants to, you know, whenever she's thinking of something or she wants to check something and so on and so forth, she'll just look it up. She won't have to remember anything, right? She just looks it up. And speaking about books, why should she learn to read? Why? She can just talk to this thing, right? Is it really necessary that she learns to read and write? You think it is, but I challenge you, maybe it's not. Sorry, we'll get to Q&A. I really don't think that it will be a necessary skill for her in this environment to learn to read and write. And certainly doing math or counting won't be necessary. She just ask this machine to do it for her. And all the information that she'll get it immediately. She doesn't need to remember anything. That, dear friends, that's the challenge. That is the problem. 2.5 years ago, I helped a senator in France draft the first law in Europe on fake news. I'm so glad it didn't pass, by the way. but it was a really interesting exercise. Now, the first recital of that law was that we need, as you say in French, to make it a grande cause nationale, right, which is the big national cause of education. And that was probably the only part of the law that I would have liked to see passed. How many teachers do we have in the room? Educators? I thought so. I thought so. Okay. You're really you're in the forefront. I mean, you are really the soldiers protecting our humanity. You really are. And our civilization. Your job will not so much be to teach reading and writing and math and the rest of it, but teaching our children, and I'm going to use another French word, which is the esprit critique. You need to make sure that our children question everything and don't have their lives and their universe dictated by this thing. Your job is to teach our children to be independent, to be autonomous, and to think and to question everything. Now, as a lawyer, it's interesting that one of the things that you learn in the courtroom and also when you have discussions and so on is there is an art which seems to be completely forgotten in education. Completely forgotten. And to me, it's the most important. And it should take place at first grade level. And that's the art of debating, right? The art of debating, forcing Maya, to argue the opposite of what this machine tells her, just for the sake of the argument. Forcing everybody in the classroom to see the other side and to argue against themselves. If we teach our children to do that, it's going to be more important than reading, writing, and math, because again, they're not going to use those skills. We need to teach them that the true meaning of relativity. We need to teach them that whatever the truth is, and I'm not going to, this could be a 3-day thing. it's most probably not what they get from this machine. There's a really interesting story about Wikipedia, right? That's where we all get our knowledge from, quote unquote, today. And look it up afterwards. It's on Wikipedia. It's called Wikipedia hoaxes, right? So these are unmasked stories on Wikipedia, scams, hoaxes. Some of them go unchallenged for years. The latest statistic I read on this is that one-third of all Wikipedia disputes are left unresolved, all right? The idea of this universal encyclopedia doesn't work. Yet it is the source of wisdom for much of us in this room, and certainly it's going to be for Maya. We need you, teachers. You need to make sure that our children, and I hope you will question everything, will be irritating. That's what you need our children to be. They must be irritating, question everything, especially since otherwise they'll be completely manipulated by the thing. So my first point was really the importance of debate and the importance of not getting information from this kind of thing, but making sure to stop disinformation. I promised to make one legal point. I got to say that when you talked about the cost-benefit analysis, and I agree, you mentioned that yesterday, everything sooner or later translates into ethics and law, so the points I just made now are also legal, but not in the strict sense of the word. But I've got one legal question here is, the corporations that will determine the view of the universe, the cosmology, the epistemology, right, of Maya, what are their obligations? I use the word epistemology, right, the science of knowledge. Today, knowledge is reduced to correlations, right? Big data is correlations. If this happens, then there is a probability then that will happen, all right? And we think that we know more because of that. Of course we don't. The world is much more than probability and statistics. The world is really, if we want to understand it, if we want to get back to cosmology, it's not correlation, it's causality, right? You remember that? The word causality doesn't exist any longer in science. Everything is probability. And the problem is that probability often works, but it doesn't give us an understanding of how the world works. We need to get back to understanding the basics, the basic importance of causality, cosmology, epistemology, and not just get information that with certain probability may be true or not true. So what is the responsibility of the corporations that will, and I use the word here consciously, manipulate Maya when she grows up? And again, this is Maya today. Who knows what her universe is going to be like when she's 10, 15, 18, and so on and so forth. I don't know whether I'd be particularly fond of being part of that thing, but I probably have to. You could ask yourself, from a legal point of view again, what is the responsibility of the Wikipedias today and their equivalent in a couple of years? And the companies that produce the games that we heard about, fascinating games, by the way, and all the other companies that do e-learning and either license it to schools or give it for free. By the way, as we all know, nothing is free, right? What is their responsibility? Now, I mentioned yesterday together with Artie that I did not download the lab for this conference. Actually, I should have, because it would have been much easier to know, what was going on and when I was going to speak and stuff like that. But I didn't. And I didn't do it because I simply stopped downloading apps. I personally did it because I had this case a couple of years ago. You all have flashlights on your phone, right? Right? Most phones are, equipped with the default flashlight, but you can also download flashlights from either Google Store or from App Store or whatever. And I had this client who had downloaded this flashlight and found out later that it included spyware, right? As I said before, nothing is free. And the case was pretty complicated because the flashlight app was developed in Ukraine. It was then put on one of the big platforms that I mentioned before by a company based in Seattle. And it was distributed in France through Vodafone and SFR. Pretty complicated case. Who was really responsible for the malware that was introduced on everyone's phone here in the case I just described? Very complicated. Now, needless to say, this is the kind of case that is settled out of court. So if you're sitting there waiting to get the answer, we could discuss what it should have been, what it shouldn't have been, and so on and so forth, but this particular case was settled out of court. The point is that if you produce something in the physical universe, right? A car, that's the typical example, thanks to the consumer movement, especially Ralph Nader and his likes in the 60s in the US. We had this new notion of product liability, right? Everybody believes, everybody feels, and rightly so, that if you introduce a product, you're responsible for for the harm that this product does, even if you don't have a contract with the consumer because you introduced that product on the market. That's called product liability. And you know what? That does not exist in the digital realm. You probably didn't think about that. And I only thought about it because of this case. It was a shocking realization, especially knowing that about 15% of all products are now sold over the internet. I'm talking about the intermediaries here like Amazon and the rest of them, and that these numbers are growing every second of the day. Product liability does not exist for digital products. Raises a lot of interesting questions in terms of 3D printing and the rest of it. We may have time for that during a Q&A, but let's get back to the point I want to make. Since product liability does not exist, the question as to who is responsible for misinformation, for manipulation, for bias in terms of education on the internet. These are key questions. Because we, again, are leaving the future of the universe that our children will build, the perception that they will have of everything, their interaction with their friends, with everybody. We are leaving that in the hands of these corporations because this is where they'll get their information from. This is the philosopher's stone. This is their source of wisdom, not their parents and not their teachers, because the teachers should only make them aware of what I just said. We need to develop a base of accountability. I use accountability as a generic term which covers product liability, but more than that. We need to make sure that if you sell or give away for free, and again, that doesn't exist, products on the internet, and especially when it comes to our children and their future, you're liable, you're accountable. That, of course, brings us to the question of how does that work? Do we need to certify and that kind of thing? All these very, very, very complicated questions. But the first thing is that if you want to enter into this realm, you are accountable for everything that may be hurtful as a consequence. Now, this is a key question, which is not only legal, but it's also very philosophical. And I think that one of the things that unfortunately we see happening because of this thing is that the notion of personal accountability is slowly withering away. It's a very, very unfortunate trend. It seems that opinions and judgments today are all made by political correctness. And that political correctness comes from what we read on this machine. Having your own point of view, defending that and standing up has always been a challenge, but now it's even worse. Because now it's really the whole world against you. And standing up for what you believe is almost suicidal today. You'll be shamed by everybody on the internet. Now, we know through history that what one man or one woman may know may be the truth. And we'll discover that 100 years later. I'm just very, very, very afraid that in this day and age of information, disinformation is going to win the battle. And standing up for your beliefs and being accountable for that is something that you as teachers, unfortunately there are only 3 or 4 of you in the room, this is your main obligation. Make sure that our children are really irritating, that they question everything, that they be trained from the first day at school to debate, to defend the opposite position, to develop this esprit critique. That's the critical skill. That's the essential skill. And the rest will flow from that. 3 seconds, that was pretty good timing, wasn't it? So, I hope that you survived this one, and look forward to the Q&As. Thank you. Thank you. So who's going to start?
Hey, can we get to the point of the school books? We already talked about the books.
Where are you?
Hello.
Over there.
Hello. You're talking about the corporations in the digital world. So what do you see as the main difference between corporations like Pearson or any other large textbook publisher who already dominates what kind of information we deliver to children? What's the difference or the main things that make this so concerning versus the existing situation?
Well, you're very right. I think that the short answer to a complicated question is concentration and monopolization.
Right.
And the effect, the pervasive, I didn't say perverse, but I was thinking perverse, the pervasive effect of this machine. I mean, she will go to bed with it, it'll be with her all the time, and it'll be a reflex, and that's the problem. I mean, how often have we not been at dinner parties when people check out stuff on the internet, and it's as if what they see there is the truth. If they want to win an argument, they say they read it on Wikipedia, right? Nonsense, complete nonsense. Well, I think that is a degree that's more than the textbook.
So my question is that in that case that you mentioned,
What?
in the case that you mentioned where someone was bloating and a spyware in the app,
Yeah.
and you said that apps, digital apps and softwares are not have a product liability,
Yeah.
but the networks, in that case Vodafone, have a network liability, and when they are using as a default app in their phone, does not that make them wrong there, and they are liable as well? So we can go back to Vodafone and say that you should not have at least made that a default app.
That was part of the case. You're absolutely right. That was absolutely part of the case. As I mentioned, SFR and Vodafone, and that was one of the real reasons why the case was settled. Now, two more words on that. The real problem here is, and bear with me because it's going to take a couple of minutes, the real problem here is that the law today, especially in the US, right, and since the US governs the internet, because that's a fact, whether we like it or not, is that these telecom providers and the internet service providers and the platforms and the search engines and the social media and so on and so forth are deemed to be what we call mere conduits, right? You've probably heard about that. So once you're a mere conduit, which the telecoms are in terms of content, not the service, but the content, then they have absolute immunity. That's the rule under the Communications Decency Act. If you want to look it up, it's Section 230 from 1996. In Europe, I'll get to your question. In Europe, we have a different approach, which we call relative immunity. It's based on the e-commerce directive from the year 2000. But unfortunately, it has very little impact because it's really American law that applies.
Hello, sir. I have a question that are we heading towards intelligence divide while trying to bridging the gap for digital divide?
The intelligence divide.
Yeah, because we see our generation has learned a lot by doing lots of activities, and this next generation is already using all these technologies. So they don't know how it all happened actually, and they are directly using the AI and all these things. You ask a question to Google Assistant that which song is playing, so it will identify you for that. So are we actually heading towards a kind of an intelligence divide, that next generation may be a kind of a dumb generation?
Well, I think that you're perfectly right. And the thing is that the more quote unquote information we get, the less wisdom we have. And that is the point. And that is one of the things that maybe you're getting to wisdom divide. Maybe that is the point you're making. And if that is the case, I totally agree. Well, our teachers have that, have that role to play. And again, you know, you the teachers, unfortunately, there are only 3 or 4 of you in the room. I mean, you are really the soldiers protecting our values. You should be the civil service that has the most prestige and the best paid in any country. Really, I think that the teachers' union, well, here you probably all agree. You should be. The future is in your hands. But just beware, don't fall into this trap of using this tool, because you're already using it quite a bit. And by the way, fantastic, I think that you haven't really, looked at your phone for the past at least 2 minutes. That's great, it's not that hard. Don't fall into the trap simply to say that innovation is a good thing. You know, I was at a conference, the Global Forum conference last week, took place in Copenhagen. And the city of Copenhagen, they're so proud of having all this innovation, turning the city of Copenhagen into what they call a smart city, and of course what I call a surveillance city. And so they had this, they developed all sorts of devices for the cashless society, right? The cashless society. I just ask myself, why is the cashless society a good thing? Why? You know, can you imagine Saturday evening, right? Your pipes bust in your kitchen. How do you get a plumber to come if you don't pay him cash? You know what I mean? Doesn't work. Doesn't work. So it's as if innovation in itself is a religion. It's new, ergo it's good. That's nonsense. Innovation caused global warming. Innovation causes cancerous diseases. Innovation created a nuclear bomb. Let's get away from this religion that innovation is good in itself. It's not.
I have a question. What do you think about, do you think that the oral narration has an edge over the technology?
Sorry?
What are your opinions about the oral narration? Does it has an edge over the technology, the digital technology, right? The oral narration.
The correlation.
The oral narration
The oral.
to the children. Do you think that it has an edge over in today's digital world?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Like, do you think oral narration has an edge over technology in the context in which you are talking to make sure that the children are irritating and make sure they engage in debates? So do you think when teachers are more into oral narration, they're more talkative with the children, do you think it has an edge over technology? It's better than technology?
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, sorry, I didn't understand your question. I really didn't want to be rude. But yes, absolutely. And it goes back to the point of debating, right? And it's really, to me, it's a lost art. It's a lost art. As I said, that innovation is not an end in itself. I'll stand up and defend that anytime you want. But an art, l'art pour l'art, as we say in French, the art for its own sake, is really debating. We could learn a lot from the ancient Greeks, and we should really not forget that all that wisdom is there already. We just have to look for it and find it and get it introduced in the schoolrooms, in the classrooms. But again, when you're 5 years old, when you're 6 years old, you're clever enough to learn the art of debating. And that will create the essential skill, which again is the subject of my presentation, which is that of questioning everything Because again, otherwise we'll all be turned into robots. You have a question?
I have a question. It kind of follows on from what Jeffrey had mentioned earlier. Is a lot of these products in the long 11-page list of conditions, they suggest a certain jurisdiction where it's going to be resolved. But the issue is now so transboundary that is there a need for some new international resolution process, that it's not within this California state, well, it's not within the US state, but it goes, well, what we have right now is the International Criminal Court, but that's just focused on the criminal acts. Is that something that is necessary to address this particular issue? Because with AI now emerging, the power of AI depends on getting as much data from across the world, not just one particular part, because then you get confined.
You just identified one of the major problems we have on the internet from a legal point of view. The universality of the internet pitted against sovereign laws. And how do we deal with that? Now, I happen to be part of a working group headed up by the Special Rapporteur on Privacy by the United Nations. And what we're working on is trying to define the national security exemption to data privacy. Read Snowden, all right? Data privacy, even in the GDPR in Europe, has exemptions when it comes to national security. Now, how do we define national security? And how do we make sure that that definition is not being abused so that whenever the government wants information, they just say it's national security? And what kind of legal procedures do we have? Do we need like a FISA court that we have in the US at an international level and so on and so forth? Now, that led us in a special working group to think about what we call an online dispute resolution mechanism. It really started off with defamation. As I said before, today the opinions and the judgments made by the public, by the wolf pack, causes people not only not to stand up for their convictions because they're going to be shamed, but also causes people to lose their reputation because of defamation. It's more or less the same thing, that everybody gets together in attacking someone and he doesn't stand up for his convictions. That's why, and that's universal. I mean, it doesn't help getting something taken down in India or in France or in Denmark or in the UK if you can still access it on a domain name .com. That's really your question. By the way, we're all waiting for a decision coming down, hopefully in February, from the European Court of Justice on that particular question relative to Europe, the US. It's called the global reach problem. But what we're working on in this UN subgroup is an online dispute resolution mechanism which will allow swift, because that's really the key. The damage is done immediately on the internet. And what's up there remains accessible in principle forever. So the damage is immediate, and it's viral, and it's there forever. So if you want to do something about that damage, speed is essential. That is why the normal legal system, whether it's arbitration or whatever conflict resolution scheme you have, simply doesn't work. You're so right. We need an online dispute resolution mechanism which all countries can agree on based on shared values. Now, this is going to be very complicated because we'll have a lot of values that are not shared, but there are quite a few that are shared by the whole international community. Suffice it to refer to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948. Each and every member of the United Nations has de facto adopted that Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which contains some 30-odd rights. Most countries have signed up to the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, which has more details about that and also has a dispute resolution mechanism, but again, that one doesn't work. So what we should be working towards is defining or implementing those rights on which we all agree, and we will find most of them in the Universal Declaration, and then have an international dispute resolution mechanism that will apply these rights to the impugned content before them. Maybe wishful thinking, but it's necessary. It's necessary if you want to maintain an internet that's universal. And that's kind of like the idea of the internet, right? This global empowerment and all these wonderful buzzwords. It really rests upon the presumption that it's universal, that we all get the same information. That's the idea. If we don't do anything about the problem that you just asked, the question you just asked, that universality of the internet is going to disappear. And what we usually say when we do policy on that is that the internet will become the splinternet. And that will also aggravate the problem of the digital divide or the misinformation, which you already see with certain countries that are not really part of that universality. We have some delegates from China, you know what I'm talking about. That country took a conscious decision of having its own internet, so to speak, with a great firewall. Do we want that all over the world? We probably don't, but it's going to happen if we don't get that dispute resolution, absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much for a very good presentation. Why it really comes home to me is because, like Maya, I have a 2.5-year-old girl, and she fights with me on the phone that it's my phone. And I've started to look at it, you know, I'm kind of like, well, pretty a bit confused when it comes to regulating that or access to, because now, even while I'm not around, she could actually have access to a phone, perhaps through her mom or something like that. So in unregulated societies, well, I came in from Nigeria, and we don't really have strong cyber laws and all that. And so talking about things like digital and online things, it's a challenge. How do one regulate that for a kid growing up and maintain a kind of a confine for the child to kind of like, you know, like grow up to like 5 or 6 to be able to be critical enough to know this is not the right thing, this is not appropriate, and this is what I should do. I need you to help me out.
It is a real problem. In France, what we did, very recent law, is that we really prohibited the use of cell phones at school. And everybody really agreed that that was a good idea. It allowed the teachers to get the necessary attention, and it also allowed the children, at least while they're at school, not to grow more and more dependent upon this special tool that becomes part of their anatomy. But of course, there is a life outside of school, and I really think that the only solution that we have is we can't prohibit our children from using this. It won't work. They'll become asocial. I mean, the peers do it, and if they don't follow what's going on already today on YouTube or whatever, they didn't pick up the latest acronyms, they'll become autistic. So it's a question of their whole existence and their way to function in social life. So we can't say you can't use the phone. But what we can do, and it's the only thing is to make them understand that most probably the information they get there is wrong. I would like them to believe it's wrong as the point of intellectual departure, rather than the opposite. It is wrong, it is wrong, it is wrong. Check it, check it, check it. You are now under an obligation to defend the opposite point of view. Connecting the dots, that's another problem. Since information is accessible, I use information here as a generic term, immediately, as I mentioned before, there's no reason to read and write and math and know anything at all because you just get it. Your memory, you don't need it anymore, right? So you won't be able to connect the dots any longer. You won't be able to go back and compare what happened with the ancient Greeks and so on. Because, you know, if you ever heard of them, it was like a nanosecond when you happened to skip by a page and you wanted to look up something with PL and you happened to enter Plato and you were looking for Plato, and then That's the kind of thing. You need to be able to connect the dots. You need to be able to get that esprit critique if you want to function. And it's really, once again, there's only one core of democracy that can help us attain that. It's not the parents. They're too busy. You know, her mother, whom I met, parents are divorced. Mother works, very tough day. She comes home. This is the babysitter, all right? This is the babysitter. And that's the danger. So really, education, to me, is not really a question of learning through the internet. It is the opposite. It is the opposite. It is selecting the information and always being critical of it and getting the global view of this universe, which is dramatically changing, a universe where people marry holograms. Just think of that. I'm not inventing it. You can look it up in the news.
Ladies and gentlemen, sorry to interrupt the questions. I'm sure we can go on, and this is a very fascinating session, but we really need to move on with the rest of the schedule. So first of all, I'd like you to thank Dan Shefet for this wonderful talk. It was an excellent interactive session.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of the morning session. Please also give a huge round of applause for both speakers, Dan Shefet and Jeffrey Morrison, for shedding some light on the topic.